Textual sources in the Bronze Age refer to a political entity called Alashiya. Most scholars now recognize this refers to the island of Cyprus, or at least part of it. But was Alashiya really a single great power, or just an island of competing cities and merchants? And how did this copper kingdom manage the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse? Let's dig in. Cyprus is situated between Syria-Palestine and the Aegean, in more ways than geographically. And what I want to draw attention to is how the archaeological phasing or periodization of Cyprus is done, as it's a bit of a fusion between the Aegean world and the regions to the east. In the Aegean, the major periods are largely based on the ceramic seriation by region. There are separate schemes for the mainland, early, middle, and late Helladic, Crete, early, middle, and late Minoan, and for the islands in the Aegean, early, middle, and late Cycladic. Near Eastern chronology is less region-specific, with early, middle, and late Bronze Ages. Cyprus largely follows the Aegean scheme with early, middle, and late Cypriot periods, with subdivisions in each of those periods which mark cultural changes evident in the archaeology. This is the periodization scheme that we will default to, with an understanding that some phases blend into others. The strong regionalization on Cyprus makes harsh chronological boundaries especially difficult for certain periods, especially the Middle Cypriot III and Late Cypriot 1A boundary. And we do want to note that the eminent Cypriot archaeologist Bernard Knapp has proposed a new nomenclature consisting of the Prehistoric Bronze Age and Protohistoric Bronze Age leading into the Iron Age. This model has a lot to be said for it. It hasn't been fully adopted by archaeologists working on Cyprus and largely exists in parallel with the traditional model, but it hasn't been rejected by any stretch, and we will follow what is often done in the academic literature and include both where we can. But whatever terms we choose, there is a consistent theme. Alashiya doesn't fit neatly into categories, and that's a big part of its story. We'll see the textual sources describe a unified kingdom associated with copper production ruled by a king who made treaties and conducted diplomacy as one of the great kingdoms of the age. The archaeology, on the other hand, shows a patchwork of villages, fortresses, and competing elites. So the recurring issue is, how do we reconcile the Alashiya of the text and the archaeology of Cyprus? Because as we'll see, a kingdom remembered abroad as powerful and unified may in fact have been far more fragmented at home. Our investigation into Alashiya actually begins not on Cyprus, but in Egypt. The first possible reference to Alashiya comes from a text called the Annals of Amenemhat II. This inscription was found in several pieces at Memphis and discusses the exploits of Amenemhat II, a 12th dynasty pharaoh who reigned in the early 19th century. In the inscription, there are several named locations. A military expedition into Lebanon is described, and then a naval expedition against two places, often identified by the letters IRS and ISY. These places are referred to as lands, but they're also written in an enclosed circle, usually identifying a fortified center. The first location has been identified as Alashiya, and the second as the port city of Ura. The naval expeditions returned with, among other things, Asiatic captives and various amounts of mineral wealth, especially copper. I will note that not all scholars accept the identification of Alashiya and Ura here. This would push the Middle Kingdom exploits farther than previously believed if we take this inscription as historical. However, some interpreters see this not as a full military conquest, but maybe a coastal raid, or even primarily as a commercial enterprise cast in military language. Further, the somewhat confused language of Land of Alashiya while also writing it as though it were a center has led to a variety of interpretations. It may be that Alashiya was recognized as a city, or it may be that it was a land, or it may be that in the early 19th century, Egyptian scribes lacked a solid understanding of the local geopolitics, and we ought not read too much into how they understood this region. However, texts from Mesopotamia may clarify things for us. There are several texts clustered in the reigns of Yahtun-Lim, and then several during the reign of Zimri-Lim. These texts discuss copper imported from a place we can identify as being called Alashiya. One text refers to a place called Alashiya, but is preceded by the sumerogram uru with the determinative ki. Ki is a determinative that often denotes geographical names. Urut and Ki is a common construction denoting a city. So in this case, Alashiya is referred to explicitly as a city. However, other texts, also from Mari, use the Sumerogram Kur, meaning land or region. So the Mariot sources refer to Alashiya as both a region or land, as well as a specific city or maybe city-state. And scholars are unsure how to best interpret this seemingly contradictory information. It may be that there was a city named Alashiya which also shared its name with the land. It may be that on the Middle Euphrates they lacked a clear understanding of the geopolitics of the land and so were imprecise in their terminology. It may also be that the land of Alashiya didn't conform to the socio-political conventions of Mesopotamia in the 18th century, and they didn't have the ideal terminology for it. In it being so distant, it wasn't worth interrogating in depth. They got their copper, who cares how the place is run? And archaeologically, it's not clear who was running Cyprus at this time. In fact, the archaeology makes it look like there wasn't anyone really in charge. Archaeologically, the 18th and the beginning of the 17th century is what is called the Middle Cypriot period. And while places like Egypt and Mesopotamia had already experienced the rise of urban civilization, its collapse, and were rising again, Cyprus had yet to have any truly urban settlement. Archaeologically, the Middle Cypriot period is characterized largely by village life, decidedly non-urban and unfortified. However, it's worth noting that much of the Middle Cypriot evidence comes from tombs with comparatively limited settlement archaeology. Early in the Middle Cypriot period, there seems to be a greater concentration of activity on the north coast, but this shifts southward over time. Since 1974, there have been no sanctioned excavations on the northern third of the island, so our knowledge of this exact process is stunted. There may be a significant Middle Cypriot center on the north coast that utilized the many cemeteries there. We just can't say given the available evidence, and we won't know until the modern political situation changes. While the Middle Cypriot is still pretty understudied on the island, there are some important trends we can observe. Middle Cypriot tombs begin to have large amounts of copper artifacts deposited in them as grave goods. This has led many scholars to argue the discovery of copper in the hills of the Troodos and technological developments necessary to extract, refine, and process the ore ultimately led to the development of socio-political complexity. That is, the discovery and subsequent urge to control the mineral resources of the island increased the pace of social stratification and the development of complex society. While this is largely accepted, there are still debates as to whether this was instigated by external forces or if it was an endogenous process. That is, was there a foreign market for copper that began this process? Merchants from Anatolia or the Syrian coast going from village to village looking for copper, which drove Cypriots to intensify their mining activity? Or was it more of an internal process where competition between families and emergent elites on Cyprus was the primary impetus? There's a very good dissertation that argues that the development of complexity on Cyprus was not entirely linear and was largely endogenous. It happened in fits and starts, and we ought not simply attribute the rise of socio-political complexity on the island to being an emergent phenomenon of international trade. And this does not negate the importance of copper to Middle and Late Bronze Age Cyprus, only that it was not an exclusively external demand that drove it. Over the course of the Middle Cypriot period, there is in general a concentration of population into fewer settlements. There are zones of population on the north coast, the south coast, and in the central plain, particularly near major rivers, with fewer sites on the actual east or west coasts. No place seems particularly dominant, though. We also don't really see any one site or region having a particular concentration of foreign goods. We don't see one site having a major concentration of foreign ceramics, where we may postulate there was one major port of entry dominated by a single site, which mediated trade between the outside world and the rest of the island. Instead, we see evidence of commerce and trade, but it has been described as opportunistic or even haphazard. It was peripheral to the larger, more centrally controlled and organized economies on the mainland. So what was Alashiya in the textual sources? What does Alashiya refer to in the 18th century? It's not clear, at least not to me. There does not appear to be any kind of state or even city-state that we can identify archaeologically on the island of Cyprus in the Middle Cypriot period. We mostly see villages. And while we can track the emergence of elites and the early formation of state-like structures, it's hard to say with any confidence that any one place could be identified as Alashiya. Now, we do have significant limits on our data for this period. The lack of urban settlement may in fact be due to urban longevity. Some Middle Cypriot sites ostensibly overlap the foundations of Late Cypriot sites. We also may be missing a major settlement somewhere on the northern third of the island, which could resolve some of our questions. However, given the evidence available, it's difficult to identify any single site with Alashiya, while it is more plausible to identify Alashiya as the name for the region of Cyprus in use by the Middle Bronze Age. The archaeology of Cyprus clearly shifts in the transition from the Middle Cypriot III to the Late Cypriot I. What is significant is the foundation of two urban centers, the sites we now call Morphu Tumbatu and Enkami, one on the west coast near Morphu Bay and the other on the east coast on the outlet of the Pedaios River into the Mediterranean. In addition to these large settlements were dozens of small fortified sites, often called fortress sites. These are concentrated in the Karpas Peninsula, the southern side of the Kyrenia Mountains, and the northeastern slopes of the Troodos Range. The fortress phenomenon has been interpreted in a variety of ways. It is generally taken to reflect major social and political changes on the island. It is taken to reflect a general sense of upheaval. Large amounts of storage jars suggest an economic function. They may have served as nodes for storage and redistribution of goods, either agricultural or mineral. However, the storage jars may also have been used to supply the forts and its occupants, like the distribution of rations, for example. Several mass burials, largely absent of grave goods, are cited as evidence of some kind of catastrophe in this area, either warfare or disease, though the osteological evidence is not particularly conclusive one way or the other. How one interprets these fortress sites largely depends on who you think built them. There are two general perspectives. One is that these are evidence of early state formation, a project of a centralized authority trying to seize control of territory through military installations. Enkami is usually the main culprit who's cited. These fortress sites may be Enkami's attempt to control an expanding hinterland around the Massoria Plain and the Karpas Peninsula. Alternatively, these may reflect local projects seeking to assert local control over resources, perhaps in response to an increasing hinterland of places like Enkami and Morphu Tumbatu. Currently, both positions can be supported by the available evidence. In addition to who you think built these sites, it also matters how one interprets the subsequent socio-political organization of the island in the 13th and 14th centuries, either centralized under Enkami's authority or a more distributed system of power with high levels of local autonomy. The transition from the Middle Cypriot III into the Late Cypriot I is further attested with a major ceramic change on the island. In the Late Cypriot period, three distinct ceramic wares, base ring, white slip, and monochrome, became dominant, though they coexisted with other wares throughout the Late Cypriot period. Over the course of the Bronze Age, these would be exported all over the eastern Mediterranean. But their adoption on the island was neither uniform nor instantaneous. The new ceramic traditions seem to begin on the west of the island as they appear somewhat suddenly. In the eastern part of the island, they appear to coexist with the Middle Cypriot ceramic tradition for a time. Tumbatu is widely recognized as a major ceramic production center early in the Late Cypriot period. For now, we want to note the change in ceramic tradition across the island comes with a change in ceramic production, which speaks to larger social and possibly political changes on the island. Further, the ceramics likely attest to new cultural practices. For example, some ceramic traditions appear to begin as part of funerary feasts, and only later become adopted into wider social use. But this period also sees major change in funerary customs from extramural graves in the Middle Cypriot to intramural in the Late Cypriot. Mortuary practices are a particularly conservative cultural custom, so the changes here are quite significant as the relationship between the living and the dead is being renegotiated. The shift away from extramural cemeteries outside villages to intramural burials inside urban centers is noteworthy. And burials become more elaborate, and luxury goods, especially imported goods, were used to mark social standing, and the intramural burials become places of competitive display and the assertion of elite status. And there are other archaeological patterns attesting to major social and cultural changes happening during this transitional period, including written language, which we'll explore later. But suffice it to say, archaeologists look to the beginning of the Late Cypriot period when Cypriot society increases in socio-political complexity. And Cyprus also appears sporadically in the textual sources of surrounding societies. In inscriptions dated to the reign of Thutmose III, a place called Alashiya is said to have sent diplomatic gifts. The text groups it with countries west of Egypt, including Keftu, what we call Crete. Alashiya was an important polity internationally in the 15th century. And some scholars who argue this is an abbreviated form of Alashiya. However, this is not certain. In some topographical lists, the traditional spelling of Alashiya appears as with the name Asiya. This doesn't necessarily mean they are different, however they could refer to Alashiya, that is Cyprus, and Ashua, or Asia, referring to Western Anatolia. The Alashiyan Confederacy was a coalition of West Anatolian polities that coalesced in the mid-15th century, and may be what Thutmose III was referring to before it was defeated by the Hittite king Tutolia I. Another more secure reference to Alashiya comes from an Anatolian source describing events which occurred during the reign of Tutolia I. In the text commonly known as the Indictment of Maduwada, the exploits of the problematic vassal Maduwada are addressed by the Hittite king. The text dates to the reign of Arnuwanda I, but many scholars understand the text to be referring to events that occurred during the reign of Tutolia. Maduwada is chastised for, among other things, raiding the land of Alashiya, which the Hittite king claimed paid tribute to him and belonged to him. The problem being that Maduwada was supposed to be a vassal and thus should not be raiding a fellow vassal of the king. Maduwada reported that he was not the only one guilty of raiding the island, and further he claims he didn't know Alashiya was subject to the Hittite king. One other text from the Hittite world dated to the late 15th or early 14th century is an evocation ritual. In the text, deities from the world around the Hittites are called on to return to Hatti, and Alashiya is listed. It's hard to say more from this source other than Alashiya was a place known to the Hittites by the early 14th century. When we look at the evidence from the 16th and 15th centuries, the evidence is less confusing, but not fully clear. Alashiya was a known place, at least by the Hittites, and the claim of domination of the island is generally not taken as fact by modern interpreters. The claims in the indictment of Maduwada are often suggested to mean that there were diplomatic or economic ties between the two, and the Hittite king did not want to upset a valued trading partner who had vast mineral wealth at his disposal. And the Egyptian evidence is not solid enough to make any firm claims. But the archaeological evidence presents us with a picture of large-scale change coming to the island beginning in the 17th century and continuing into the 16th and 15th centuries. The foundation and growth of Enkumi points to a growing elite on the island. It is curious this happens on the more culturally conservative half of the island, but by the end of the late Cypriot I, we see cultural and social changes across the island. Ceramic and mortuary changes with a new tiered settlement hierarchy with truly urban settlements finally appearing on the island all point to the foundation of a polity. But what kind of polity isn't clear. Alashiya enters the historical and archaeological record more fully and clearly beginning in the 14th century. This time period archaeologically covers the end of the late Cypriot IIA and the entirety of the late Cypriot IIB. Textually, there are sporadic references to Alashiya from the early 14th century, to inventory lists from the Hittite capital of Hattusha refer specifically to linen from Alashiya, and this can be taken as evidence for at least economic contacts, but we may reasonably expect diplomatic contact as well. And a copy of a letter from the pharaoh Amenhotep III found at Ugarit refers to all the gods of Alashiya, but it also refers to a king of Alashiya. The letter is fragmentary, so it's not prudent to draw too many other conclusions other than to conclude there was, for the first time in the historical record, a king of Alashiya who may have conducted these diplomatic relations. The most important data set for Alashiya in the 14th century is the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters are a corpus of epistolary tablets discovered at the modern site of Tel el Amarna, the ancient capital of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten. The site was occupied for a short time and includes letters from the end of the reign of Amenhotep III, the full reign of Akhenaten, and the beginning of the reign of Tutankhamun. William Moran, an expert and translator of the Amarna letters, argues all of the letters from and to Alashiya date within the reign of Akhenaten, so between 1353 and 1336. There are 8 letters that are written between the king of Alashiya and the pharaoh, and it gives us an important window into the kingdom of Alashiya during this time period. We aren't going to go through every letter in extreme detail. Instead, we want to give some highlights and see what trends appear. First off, there's something to be said about the tablets themselves. Scholars have examined the mineralogical profile of several tablets sent from Alashiya to the pharaoh, and a general source location for the letters has been isolated on the southern coast of the island of Cyprus. This study secured the island of Cyprus as the location of Alashiya, which is in part why we haven't dedicated too much time to the historical exploration of this question, as the petrographic studies have settled this question once and for all. For those who are interested in this particular question, about where Alashiya was and how petrographic studies work, there are citations in the description below where you can find all of these studies. But the principle is that clay has distinct regional profiles. Clay from different places will have different concentrations of minerals and have different chemical profile depending on things like local geology. Because of this variability, different techniques like petrography and neutron activation analysis can be used to determine a general region from where the clay used to create an artifact derived. Because clay is abundant and heavy, it's usually not transported as a raw good. Local clay sources are used to make clay artifacts, so the region from which the clay derives is usually the location where the artifact was created. Hundreds of Amarna letters have been examined, and 4 letters from Alashiya show that the most likely location is the southern coast of Cyprus, perhaps between the late Cypriot centers of Kalavassos Ios Dimitrios and Elassa Paleo-Taverna. The paleography and language of the tablets is Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the era. Of the 8 letters, 4 are written in the Canano-Akkadian dialect used by the South Levantine vassals. It's sort of a Creole language that mixes Akkadian and West Semitic linguistic elements. A few texts may reflect a higher degree of linguistic training, and one text shows more linguistic influence from Syria and the Orontes Valley. All but one of these letters are exchanged between the king of Egypt and the king of Alashiya. One letter is sent from the governor of Cyprus to the governor of Egypt. The kings use the traditional familiar language known in diplomatic correspondence of the day, wherein kings of equal status address one another as brothers and subordinates address superiors as father. The king of Alashiya always refers to the king of Egypt as brother. This indicates that Alashiya was considered one of the great kingdoms of the day. We also see in all but one of the letters the standard greeting formula, the message to the recipient from the sender. In EA34, this is reversed, where the sender is put first before the recipient. And there are a few examples of this elsewhere in the corpus, and it's not clear if this is just a scribal faux pas or an international diplomatic slight. It may be a diplomatic slight, as some of the letters indicate relations between Alashiya and Egypt were not particularly warm. In EA35, the king seems to be making excuses for why he sent a smaller than expected gift, and then emphasizes his close diplomatic ties with Pharaoh's rivals. In EA38, the king of Alashiya excuses raids on Egyptian territory. Letters 39 and 40 ought to be taken together, and depending on how they are interpreted, may point to a lack of a gift reciprocity between the two kingdoms, which was a standard and expected part of diplomacy at the time. So while nothing is definitive, there are a few indicators that relations were not great. And these letters were accompanied by diplomats who could expand on the contents and explain where they were ambiguous, so we again should be cautious reading too deeply into passive-aggressive tones. However, we also see that the pharaoh had detained one of the messengers of the king of Alashiya, and he had to request that he be released. Detaining diplomatic messengers was not uncommon, but could be seen as a signal of poor diplomatic relations. There is surprisingly little in the Amarna letters that we can use to construct Alashiyan culture or history. EA35 mentions the Hand of Nergal. The term translated by Moran as Nergal might also be translated as Reshef, a deity similarly associated with pestilence, but it may also be an allusion to a deity specific to Alashiya. The king is relaying that a plague has caused trouble in his land, which has killed not only his young wife, but also all of his copper workers, which is why the pharaoh may not be satisfied with the copper brought to Egypt. There are several other instances of plague in the ancient world, even in the 14th century, so there's little reason to doubt the historicity of the claim, though it's not entirely out of bounds of reason that he is citing a plague as a major event when it may have been in fact relatively minor and used to justify a smaller greeting gift to the pharaoh. In EA38, it's also noteworthy as in it the king of Alashiya tells the pharaoh that while the pharaoh has his shores raided, so too does the king of Alashiya. Men of Luki year by year seize villages in my own country. The king says his own men did not partake in these raids, but if they did, then Pharaoh should send them to him and he can deal with them appropriately. And this again can be interpreted in a variety of ways. We may take this at face value, that raiding was just a part of life in the 14th century. Or it may be that the king of Alashiya was feigning ignorance and he's saving face with the pharaoh to maintain diplomatic relations. or it may be taken as a sign that the king doesn't control his kingdom in the way that the pharaoh believes he does. The final point I want to make is that nearly all of the references to Alashiya in the Amarna letters make reference to copper. Only EA 38 and 39 don't make explicit mention of it. Cyprus has a distinct geology as an island. It was not volcanically formed, but through tectonic uplift. Because of the geological formation of the island, it is rich in mineral resources, especially copper, mostly concentrated in the Troodos ophiolite, especially in what are called pillow lava formations. That is, geological formation of pillow-shaped stones that are formed when magma is extruded into a subterranean environment. For much of the Bronze Age, this meant that access to copper-rich stone was relatively easy and it was comparatively abundant. As discussed earlier, it's an ongoing question as to how much international appetites for copper instigated formation of state function on the island, but here we see by the 14th century, Egypt had an interest in the ore and wanted massive quantities. EA 35 records 500 talents being sent at once. Now, the talent was not fully standardized across regions in the Bronze Age, but using roughly 60 pounds for the weight of a talent, that would be about 30,000 pounds of copper in a single shipment to a single kingdom. These were typically formed into what are called oxide ingots, and several examples have been found in excavation, notably at the Uluburun shipwreck. Whatever the specific ideological role of copper was in society in Cyprus during the late Bronze Age, it certainly was significant. The late Cypriot IIC is the best attested period archaeologically on the island, covering roughly the entirety of the 13th century. The earlier LC IIA and B are attested, but with much smaller windows and largely in mortuary contexts. Alashiya is also much more frequently attested in the textual record. Again, we're not going to cover every textual source, but want to identify trends and highlight specific examples that are high impact for understanding various aspects of Alashiyan history and culture. The textual sources for this period are mostly Hittite and Ugaritic. We will try to cover them roughly chronologically, but not all of these texts have secured dates, so it will be approximate. As a quick aside, I want to note that when we look at the textual and archaeological record, we should keep in mind the modern political situation in Cyprus can loom large. The northern third of the island of Cyprus is occupied by Turkish forces, and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has been declared as a sovereign state, recognized only by the country of Turkey. This has been the situation since the 70s, and Turkey is quick to note it acted in response to Greek political meddling on the island. So as we look at questions of, say, Hittite imperialism and control of the island, alongside questions of Mycenaean, that is Greek, influence and possible immigration to the island, you can see how archaeologists, especially Cypriot archaeologists, may have the modern political situation looming large in how they understand these texts. So, from the early 13th century, we can see two Hittite texts which describe Alashiya as a place of exile. In the Plague Prayers of Marshili II, he describes how his father deposed Tutholiya the Younger, and now for his father's sins, the land of Hatti was suffering a plague. Those who supported Tutholiya the Younger, widely acknowledged as the rightful heir of Tutholiya III, were exiled to Alashiya. This would have happened sometime in the 14th century, but is described early in the 13th century. Alashiya is again a place of exile for political rivals in the apology of Hattusili III. There are several other Hittite texts likely from the first half of the 13th century or late 14th century. Some of these are fragmentary, and references to Alashiya are basically just the name. Others include incantations or inventories which mention Alashiya. At Ugarit, there are a few textual references dated to the early 13th century which are of note. The first is PRU 4.55, dated to either late in the reign of Nikmepa or early in the reign of Amithtamru II. This text records how the Queen Mother, Ahatnilku, wife of Nikmepa and mother of Amithtamru, negotiated the exile of two sons to Alashiya. There are several texts which, like the Hittite corpus, mention Alashiya or seem to mention individuals from Alashiya, which we will address a bit more in a moment. The vast majority of the textual references to Alashiya come from the waning days of the 13th century and early 12th century. Again, there are several texts from the late 13th century which list names and inventory items from Alashiya, but there are several more we want to focus on which offer distinct insight into how the island was organized and interacted with the wider world. For example, there's a fragmentary text which is a treaty between the Hittites and Alashiya. It's not clear exactly when the treaty dates. it may be from the reign of Shupiliuma II, or more likely his father Tutulia IV. The treaty is pretty standard, following the standard Hittite covenantal formulas. However, we see in part of the text the treaty is directed to the king of Alashiya and the Pedori. The Pedori is the title of an official who served on Cyprus, and the treaty is apparently also binding on this figure, suggesting they shared power with the king to some extent. The treaty at times uses second-person plural forms when referring to the king of Alashiya, which is likely done to refer to both the king and the Pedori. And one final note on this treaty is that a city on Cyprus is partially named. We have the final sounds, Uma, which Gary Beckman has reconstructed to Enkuma. Other Hittite texts dated to the reign of Shupiliuma II also provide some insight into Alashiya. The text as we have it is a list of copies of public inscriptions of Tutulia IV compiled with some additions during the reign of Shupiliuma II. The first passage was originally on a statue, and another was a public inscription, and both are about interactions with Alashiya. What Tutulia claims in the first inscription is that he conquered the land of Alashiya, captured its king and his family, seized large amounts of wealth, and took it back to Hattusha. Then we have a list of tribute required of the king of Alashiya and the Pedori. It's not clear how the second passage in question relates to the first. It's possible the exploits described in both accounts should be attributed to the same figure. It's also been proposed the second passage is thematically linked with the first, and so is an addendum to those of the first. That is, Shupilium was recording his victories over Alashiya after those of his father. If this is the case, it may indicate Tutulia's conquests were less permanent than he may have led us to believe. The second passage records how Shupiliuma reached the sea, some translations will say he crossed the sea, and ships of Alashiya met him in the sea 3 times for battle. Shupiliuma claims he was victorious and set fire to the ships while at sea. And this is actually the first recorded account of a naval battle. Shupiliuma continues though that an army of Alashiya met him on land and the two sides fought. The inscription is broken and we don't know the outcome, but no doubt the text would record a Hittite victory. There are several texts that come from Ugarit. In addition to the palace archive at Ugarit, there are several houses which maintained records. Relevant for us are the archives in the house of Urtenu and the house of Rapanu. Rapanu was an influential figure at court, a scribe and close advisor of the king. He may have operated like a prefect. Several scholars posit that he may have been the highest non-royal official in the city. Urtenu was also a man of high standing, a merchant and an influential figure in the city. These are not just interesting biographical details, but factor into the archives these men kept as they relate to corresponding with places like Alashiya. For example, from the Rapanu archive is this text. And this is a relatively short text as it is now fragmentary. We do have the beginning of the letter where the king of Ugarit, Nikmadu, addresses the king of Alashiya and calls him my father. Scholars recognize this, like the Amarna letters, is a recognition of the Alashiyan kingdom as higher in the international hierarchy. Also in the Rapanu archives is this text. Here we finally have a named Alashiyan official. The letter is in Akkadian and is from a man who identifies as Eshuwara, the senior governor of Alashiya. This position of governor is likely the same title of Peduri in the Hittite text and is the same position in Amarna letter 40. Notably, in the letter, Eshuwara is warning Ugarit that 20 ships have sailed and he doesn't know where they are heading, so Ugarit ought to prepare. Also from the Rapanu archive is RSL1. This letter may be from Alashiya, where the king, presumably the Alashiyan king, is warning Ugarit that if enemy ships are at sea, as Ugarit fears, then Ugarit ought to prepare accordingly. It's kind of noteworthy that in the Ugaritic corpus, Alashiya does not seem particularly worried about the threat of enemy ships at sea, only warning others to take defensive measures. We see this again in RS 20.238, where the Ugaritic king Amarappi II, again addressing the king of Alashiya as my father, pleads for assistance as 7 enemy ships are threatening Ugarit while Ugarit's fleet is abroad. From the Urtenu residence are several noteworthy texts. About 500 tablets have been found in the house, and most are in Akkadian. 2 texts are from 2 different great commissioners, named Shinama and Shangiwa, and these tablets are almost certainly from Alashiya based on the context of the letters. One of them is written to the king of Ugarit directly and does not address him as my father, attesting to the influence of the Great Commissioner and his ability to address another king on equal terms. Finally, from the Urtenu archive, we finally find a name of a king of Alashiya. In this tablet, a king named Kushmashusha writes to the king of Ugarit, Nigmaru III, about shipments of copper. The king of Ugarit is called my son by the king of Alashiya, again indicating the inferiority of the kingdom of Ugarit compared to the kingdom of Alashiya. As for the name, there are differing opinions. The Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen does not believe the name is either Egyptian or more broadly Semitic. He doesn't believe it to be Hittite or even Luwian or Hurrian, positing possibly a Mycenaean derivation for the name. However, the prefix Kush may be an abbreviated form of the Hurrian Kushu, which is the name of the Hurrian moon god. The only other royal name we have from Alashiya comes from the Tale of One Amun, a story usually dated to the 22nd dynasty or roughly the early 10th century, and is generally regarded as mostly fiction, so perhaps not entirely helpful for reconstructing the history of Bronze Age Alashiya. In the story, One Amun is blown off course and ends up in Alashiya but is saved by Hatbi, the princess of the town. The textual sources are only part of the story though. Just as importantly, we want to examine, again in broad strokes, the archaeology of late Cypriot 2C Cyprus. Whereas Morphu, Timbuktu, and Enkmi were the earliest urban settlements on the island dating to the 16th century, by the 13th century several other urban centers are attested on the island. However, it's interesting that while these are largely recognized as urban settlements, there is a wide variety in what these urban sites look like. Sites like Enkmi look like a traditional Near Eastern walled urban center, whereas Moroni is spread out, unfortified, and a much more distributed form of settlement. There is a clear settlement hierarchy, with small agricultural hamlets at the bottom, two mid-tiers with ceremonial, transport, industrial, and administrative sites, and urban coastal centers, primarily Enkmi, Kidian, Hala Sultan Teke, Moroni, Kalavasos Ios Demetrios, Episcopi Bambula, Alasa, Pelopaphos, and Morphu Timbuktu. These sites all have significant late Cypriot 2C strata, and in many cases have not been widely excavated to expose potential late Cypriot 2A or B strata, so the foundations of these sites is not entirely clear. Examining the archaeological data from these sites as well as some of the textual sources, we can gain even more insight into Alashiyan culture. Alashiyan religion is somewhat debated. Cultic architecture is similar to contemporary Levantine cultic architecture, so for this reason, among others, many scholars believe there were deities worshipped on the island of Cyprus which had analogues on the mainland. For example, there was a major cult center at Pelopaphos which, in the Iron Age and later, was associated with Aphrodite, but worship of Aphrodite specifically is not typically projected back into the late Bronze Age. Instead, Ishtar worship is. This is done in part because the Hittite treaty instructs the stipulations be kept before Ishtar, meaning the goddess must have been revered on the island. We also see in the text where the two Ugaritic princes are exiled to the island, they are compelled to swear before Ishtar of the Steppes, suggesting she was believed to have power on the island and could thus hold them to their oath. In fact, the name Alashiya has long been understood to be a Hurrian word derived from the noun lady or queen with two toponymic suffixes, making the term mean land of the divine lady. Archaeologically, the most notable deities depicted are the so-called ingot god and the horned god. These figurines are found at Enkmi and represent male deities. The ingot god is so called because he is standing on an oxide ingot, the standard form copper ingots were formed into for shipping off of the island. He's in a familiar smiting deity pose known from Near Eastern statuettes. The iconography of the ingot god is reminiscent of the Syro-Palestinian deity Baal, though the addition of the ingot may make it a distinctly Cypriot iteration of the storm god. The horn god is different. This figure has long been linked with an early iteration of Apollo, especially as a deity of shepherds. More specifically, it may be a distinct local Cypriot deity which would later become identified with Apollo. There was a major cultic shrine to Apollo on the southern coast near the city of Korion. A tablet from Ugarit catalogs households in the city of Alashiya, postulated to be Enkmi. The text is fragmentary, but of the names that are recorded, we find a surprising linguistic diversity. Hurrian, Ugaritic, or maybe more generally West Semitic, and either Luwian or Hittite. The name Eshuwara, the governor of the island, has likewise been postulated to have a Hurrian origin by incorporating the theophoric element of Shuwara, which, given the propensity for Hurrian to interchange L and R, is taken to refer to the goddess Shuwal, an underworld deity. There are only about 30 personal names preserved in documentary sources, and there is a consistent breakdown of Hurrian, West Semitic, and Luwian or Hittite. The diversity of names has been a source of both frustration and promise for decoding the as yet undeciphered cypro-minoan script found on Cyprus. This script is known from about 250 inscriptions found on tablets, seals, and clay balls. The script shows a large degree of diversity, perhaps demonstrating regionalism in use and a lack of real standardization. Also, about 1/3 of the inscriptions come on clay balls where there are often only limited signs, sometimes even only a single sign, suggesting the sign functioned as an abbreviation. There are also tablets which use the cypro-minoan script, but these tablets are not standardized. That is, they don't conform to the standard form or size of either the cuneiform world of the Near East or even the linear B Aegean textual tradition. Furthermore, there are no signs which can be universally agreed upon to be logographic or numerals, which again points away from a standardized script used in an island-wide bureaucracy. Given how ancient languages are typically deciphered, there is currently not a lot of expectation for an agreed decipherment. There simply aren't enough known signs on enough documentary samples to come up with a translation. Linear B, for example, had a significantly larger corpus with much more signs to work with, leading most scholars to say we simply don't have a large enough corpus for cypro-minoan to work. But this hasn't stopped people from trying. Some scholars think the script was used to write several different languages. It wasn't tied to a single language at all, which would make decipherment all but impossible, barring the discovery of a bilingual text. Attempts starting from the assumption the language is a form of Greek, like Linear B, have proven this is not in fact a form of Greek. Other scholars have suggested the script was used to write Hurrian, but this is not generally accepted. Fred Woudhausen has similarly argued for a translation based off of Luwian, but this too has not gotten widespread acceptance within Cypriot archaeology. However, the ethnic diversity in the island makes both reconstructions reasonable starting points, and if future excavations reveal more samples, we may have a decent shot at traditional decipherment. One of the key questions about Alashiya is about how the polity was organized. We've discussed this in some depth in another video, which you can go check out if you want to see that full discussion. But in broad strokes, text and archaeology are seemingly at odds on how to approach the Alashiyan state. Textually, it appears a single king ruled over the island of Cyprus, albeit with a powerful deputy, but otherwise very much a typical late Bronze Age polity. If we had no texts, archaeologists would posit the island was composed of several small polities, a polity at Enkami, one at Moroni, one in the Vasilikos Valley, one in the Chorus Valley, and so on. This debate has been cast in the language of heterarchy versus hierarchy, following the verbiage of Priscilla Kiswani. The simple fact, though, is that text and archaeology do work together. They have to. We may be misunderstanding various aspects of them, but they must work. So the question is how to rectify what appears to be strong regionalism, with textual sources indicating only one authority on the island. And there are several ways of harmonizing text and archaeology for Alashiya in the 13th and 14th centuries. First, the textual data can be weighted more heavily, and we can see a single polity ruled by a king. In this scenario, Enkami is usually the city of Alashiya as the oldest urban center. The other palatial centers and inland cities, likely overseen by elite families or regional networks, are still subject to the king. For those who see a strictly hierarchical model at work, the king may simply be a first among equals kind of figure. He would have ruled from somewhere on the island, but possibly not even consistently from the same spot, and may have only presented to the outside world as a king of a unified state when it was, in actuality, much more complicated. What makes the most sense to me is something somewhere in between, or even a shifting between options over time. Enkami is certainly an old site, the first real urban center, but it lacks any truly palatial or clear administrative structures. There are sanctuary buildings and industrial areas, but unlike places like Moroni, Kalavasos, and Alasa, there are no palaces or administrative buildings. Furthermore, the Amarna letters from Alashiya were made on clay which came from somewhere on the south coast of Cyprus, and presumably the scribe who wrote them worked nearby, like Alasa or Kalavasos. The textual evidence clearly refers to a king but alludes to a governor or grand commissioner, the Peduri from Hittite sources, which assumes lower level commissioners. These officials had a large degree of power and influence in the court, and we see similar officials at the Ugaritic court. In Alashiya, we even see that they are bound to the same terms as the king in the Hittite vassal treaty. A very tentative model for the Alashiyan state may then see the royal center or centers on the south coast. A single king conducting diplomacy may have been an important image to project to the wider world, but may not have been an entirely accurate reflection of the facts on the ground in the Late Bronze Age. Enkumi may have began as the central unifying force as a place where copper was gathered and exported. It may have been the first political center on the island, where outsiders could interact with Alashiya. But it's not clear if it stayed that way, especially as it apparently lost its monopoly on processing the local copper ore, likely by the 14th century. By the 13th century, Enkumi may have functioned like an economic gateway. Studies on the distribution of Mycenaean ceramics suggest Cyprus, especially Enkumi, may have served as a hub for trade where Aegean and even Cypriot merchants brought goods which were then moved to other places like Ugarit and beyond. Also, slightly over 100 cypro-minoan inscriptions have been found at Ugarit, pointing at strong economic ties, possibly specifically with Enkumi. The powerful civic officials in the textual record may reflect the regionalism and hierarchical view the archaeology seems to indicate. Influential elite merchant families likely exerted a great deal of influence in the Alashiyan court while simultaneously engaging in competitive display in intra-urban contexts, as we see in the mortuary customs. These merchant families may have, like Urtenu at Ugarit, maintained a network of international contacts with which they conducted business, further enhancing not only their own wealth, but social and political standing on the island. These families may not have ruled over autonomous polities, but certainly exerted large degrees of autonomy over local resources and kept commercial ties while operating under the auspices of the King of Alashiya, who was responsible, or officially, maintaining foreign relations and diplomacy. Because of how important the copper from Cyprus was to the wider international community, different states may have tolerated the peculiar situation on Cyprus. Because the flow of copper was so important, they may have treated Cyprus as an equal, while it may not have been deserving of that kind of diplomatic respect. Whatever the international community saw, the data indicates local control over local resources, especially copper, created powerful regional families controlling regional networks that may have formally recognized the authority of the king, but likely pursued strategies of autonomy which we will see served them well in the coming years of crisis. The 12th century is called the Late Cypriot 3A on Cyprus. The early LC 3A sees the collapse of the Hittite kingdom in the 1190s, the fall of Ugarit and several Syro-Levantine polities in the 1180s. The Aegean entered the post-Palatial period around the same time. Scholars recognize region-wide episodes of collapse, but there are ongoing questions as to what happens on Cyprus. What happens to Alashiya? Most of our written sources go silent, and we're left with archaeology and logical inferences made from the final documentary evidence available. It's clear that the Eastern Mediterranean was in crisis, for reasons we aren't fully going to get into now. The Hittites suffered a catastrophic drought. The king of Ugarit was worried about hostile fleets, something the king of Alashiya was well aware of. And because of some of the textual sources discussed earlier, it's a bit of an open question of how the island of Cyprus weathered the sea peoples. And did Alashiya collapse in the traditional sense of the term, or was there a transition without a crisis? There is a settlement pattern shift in the LC3A. Enkumi was destroyed at the end of the LC2C, as was Sinda, an inland site often connected with Enkumi. Enkumi had some rebuilding early in the LC3A, but that was abandoned. It's not clear why. It's been suggested the harbor silted up, making Enkumi less viable. The Iron Age city of Salamis was founded nearby, likely in a place with a more suitable harbor. Hala Sultan Teke may have had a similar issue, leading to it being eclipsed by nearby Kidian. Moroni and Kalivassos were abandoned at the end of the LC2C with no evidence of destruction. Sites in the Chorus continued into the LC3A before they too were eventually abandoned. Paleopaphos apparently thrived during the LC IIIA and didn't suffer any of the issues other sites on the southern coast experienced. There are very few new foundations known from this period. Ma Paleocastra on the west coast, Idalian and Beleri, and Pila Kokinokromos near Kidian are the only ones. And these sites have varying interpretations. Ma, for example, is on a peninsula with no fresh water source and has a large cyclopean wall separating it from the mainland. The original excavator, a big proponent of enosis, that is, the union of modern Cyprus with modern Greece, interpreted it as a Mycenaean colony. However, the data doesn't fully support this. Unlike Idalian, which became an Iron Age city kingdom center, both Ma and Pila were abandoned by the end of the LC IIIA, making them extremely short-lived. But both were fortified, both with man-made walls as well as being on naturally defensive terrain. Since neither has a fresh water source, many suspected they were founded by outsiders who lacked knowledge of local geography. However, more recently, these have been interpreted as expansions of Paleopaphos and Kidian, the two urban centers that appear to survive the transition from the LC2C to LC IIIA unscathed. Both sites are near copper deposits. Both have slag indicating metallurgical activities. Both have weights suggesting commerce. Both are near what were at the time suitable anchorages further pointing to commerce. Both have a variety of imported goods, Aegean fine wares and Canaanite storage jars. So these may be better understood not as colonial ventures from the Aegean, but attempts to expand regional influence by Kidian and Paleopaphos. As for the Sea People phenomenon, there are some significant archaeological clues. The Philistines are the best understood of all of the groups in the Sea Peoples Confederation. Excavations at sites like Tel Mikne, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Tel Asafi, and even Tel Kasila have produced a massive amount of data and allow for a much more granular examination of the Philistines' culture and history. And part of this includes a clear ceramic seriation beginning with what we now call Philistine monochrome, developing into Philistine bichrome, and then turning into late Philistine decorated ware in the 10th century. Philistine material culture shows multiple cultural influences on it. And early excavators identified what we now call Philistine monochrome as locally manufactured late Mycenaean 3C1B, identifying it as essentially a Mycenaean-style vessel but made with local clays, as confirmed by neutron activation analysis. More recent studies, though, point to less of a Mycenaean connection and more of a cypriot influence. The Mycenaean influence is still present, but mediated through Cyprus and the white-painted wheel-made ceramics which were made in the late Cypriot 3A. So at least some of the Sea Peoples have a cultural affinity with Cyprus. That is not to say they are Cypriot by any means, only that there are some connections, even if they're only economic. But some of the textual sources from the 13th and early 12th centuries suggest Alashiya may have been involved with the Sea Peoples to some extent. Some interpreters of the inscriptions of Shupilium II suggest he fought not native Alashians, but enemies who originated on Alashiya. People who may have used Alashiya as a temporary base, people like the Sea Peoples. This may explain why the king was forced into conquering Alashiya again after his father had already claimed to do so, if the enemy on Alashiya was not actually the kingdom of Alashiya, but Sea Peoples. Ramses III in his mortuary relief lists Alashiya as one of the kingdoms ravaged by the Sea Peoples. But what the Sea Peoples phenomenon actually was has been reconsidered in recent years, not as perpetrators of the collapse, but as victims. As the Near Eastern world collapsed, opportunists banded together in search of greener pastures. It's reasonable Cyprus would have been visited by some of these groups. And given the more distributed power dynamic on the island, it's also possible that Sea Peoples may have found not a unified front either supporting or opposing them. They may have found enclaves which supported them, in perhaps exchange for not being destroyed. Perhaps Cyprus had long been a home to pirates and freebooters. It's a possibility scholars have long discussed. But the evidence for violent destruction across Cyprus is not strong. But there's also no evidence for a unified Alashiya in the Iron Age. So what happened to Alashiya? There's no clear answer, but a reasonable speculation would be that as their trading partners collapsed, the market for copper dried up. Controlling the copper trade is almost certainly what led to the development of the state, and the failure of the copper trade may be what led to its dissolution. This failure was likely not catastrophic, it wasn't sudden. Cyprus continued to maintain commercial contacts abroad, particularly places like Euboea and Greece. And some regions fared better than others. The end of Alashiya may have been a slow fate, where it lingered on long after the rest of the Near Eastern kingdoms had gone. But a kingdom built on copper would find it had no place in an age of iron.